My stepfather Marcus tore my iPhone from my hands with such force that I heard my shoulder pop. The familiar sting of his fingers wrapping around my wrist made me freeze, just like when I was 8 years old and learning to stay perfectly still during his inspection times. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Madison?" His voice carried that dangerous edge I'd learned to fear over the years. I stood there in our suburban Denver kitchen, watching him scroll through my messages with my boyfriend Tyler. The granite countertops that my mother Janet had been so proud of when they renovated suddenly felt like a monument to everything wrong in this house. When I reached for my phone, Marcus's free hand shot out and shoved me backward into the breakfast bar. You were supposed to be mine," he whispered, his gray eyes fixed on my face with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "All mine." That was 18 months ago, when I was 16. Now, at 17, I understand that some people think playing dumb is just about survival. They're wrong. Sometimes playing dumb is about collecting intelligence, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back at everyone who ever thought you were powerless. The inappropriate attention had started when I was 8, right after Mom married Marcus. I remember the first time he insisted on helping me with my bath, telling Mom he was bonding with his new daughter. I didn't have words for what felt wrong about his lingering stare when I wore my swimsuit for our family pool parties, or why his hugs lasted too long and his hands wandered to places that made my stomach twist. By the time I was 10, I'd developed an internal alarm system. Whenever Mom left for her weekend book club meetings or her evening yoga classes, I'd find reasons to be anywhere Marcus wasn't. I became an expert at creating distance, homework in my room with the door locked, sleepovers at friends' houses, after-school activities that kept me away until Mom came home. The system worked perfectly until I turned 14 and my body started changing. That's when Marcus's behavior shifted from covert to calculated. Suddenly, he was buying me expensive clothes that were always a size too small. He convinced Mom I needed a larger bedroom, and personally oversaw converting the basement into my private space, complete with a bathroom that I later realized had a lock that could be opened from the outside. For almost 2 years, I convinced myself that maybe I'd imagined the early warning signs. Marcus seemed like a devoted stepfather. He drove me to soccer practice, helped with my science fair projects, and even defended me when Mom complained about my messy room or attitude. He was the only adult who seemed to understand that being a teenage girl in today's world was complicated and overwhelming. When I got my first serious boyfriend, Tyler Chen, a sweet junior on the wrestling team, Marcus's reaction was perfectly calibrated. He played the protective but understanding father figure, cracking jokes about boys only wanting one thing while assuring me he trusted my judgment. I desperately wanted to believe this version of him was real, but the punishments started slowly. Our Saturday morning breakfast tradition at IHOP suddenly became too busy with work. The driving lessons he'd promised were postponed indefinitely. When I tried to talk about school or friends, his responses became clipped and dismissive. I told myself he was just adjusting to the reality that I was growing up. Then came that December afternoon when everything shattered. I was standing in the hallway outside my basement room, texting Tyler about our plans for winter formal, when Marcus appeared at the top of the stairs. Before I could react, he was down the steps and ripping the phone from my hands with enough force that my wrist twisted painfully. What the hell do you think you're doing?" The controlled rage in his voice was unlike anything I'd heard before, even during his worst fights with Mom. He scrolled through our messages while I stood frozen, watching his face contort with what I can only describe as jealousy. When I finally gathered the courage to reach for my phone, he shoved me so hard I stumbled backward into my desk chair. The silence stretched between us like a live wire. Marcus stood there holding my phone, and for a terrifying moment I thought I saw tears in his eyes. Then he spoke the words that would haunt me for months. "Yes, you were supposed to be mine, Madison. Mine." My blood turned to ice water. In that instant, every instinct I'd developed over the years crystallized into absolute certainty. I was in danger, and no one was coming to save me. That night, I made two critical decisions. First, I needed to get out of this house. Second, I needed somewhere safe to go. Since Dad had moved to Portland after the divorce and barely maintained contact, and Mom's family lived scattered across different states, I had limited options. I decided to call Aunt Rebecca, Mom's younger sister who lived in Fort Collins, about 90 minutes north of Denver. Rebecca had always been the fun aunt, single, successful, working as a marketing director for a tech startup. During family gatherings, she'd slip me $20 bills and tell stories about her adventures traveling for work. "Madison, what a wonderful surprise," Rebecca said when I called that Thursday night. "Is everything okay, sweetie?" I carefully explained that I was feeling overwhelmed with school and family stuff and wondered if I could visit for a weekend to clear my head. Rebecca immediately invited me to stay as long as I needed and even offered to pick me up herself. That Saturday morning, I told Mom and Marcus I was going to Rebecca's for a girls' weekend. Mom barely looked up from her laptop where she was planning her next catering event, and Marcus just grunted from behind his newspaper. Neither of them seemed to register that I was packing enough clothes for more than 2 days. The 90-minute drive to Fort Collins felt like a journey to another world. Rebecca's house was a modern townhome with an open floor plan, huge windows, and not a single family photo featuring Marcus. When she opened the front door, her smile was so genuine and warm that I nearly burst into tears right there on her doorstep. "Come here, baby girl," she said, pulling me into a hug that felt like the first safe space I'd experienced in years. We spent that first evening talking about college applications, career possibilities, and whether I was excited about graduating next year. Rebecca cooked us homemade pasta and opened a bottle of wine, pouring me a small glass, because you're practically an adult now, and in Europe, this would be completely normal. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe properly. That night, as Rebecca was showing me to the guest room, she handed me a small lavender-scented pillow and said casually, "I know about Marcus, sweetheart. You're safe here." I started crying so hard that Rebecca had to help me sit down on the bed. I hadn't realized how desperately I'd needed someone to acknowledge what was happening, to validate that my instincts weren't wrong. "How long have you known?" I managed to ask between sobs. "I suspected something during Janet's wedding," Rebecca said, sitting beside me and rubbing circles on my back. "The way he looked at you, even when you were just 8 years old, it made my skin crawl. I tried talking to your mom, but she was so happy to be remarried and financially stable again that she didn't want to hear it." We stayed up until almost 3 a.m. that night, with Rebecca listening as I poured out years of confusion, fear, and carefully suppressed memories. She validated every instinct I'd had, explained the grooming behaviors I'd experienced, and assured me that none of it was my fault. The next week passed like a beautiful dream. Rebecca worked from home most days, so I had company while completing my remote schoolwork. She taught me meditation techniques and helped me research college programs in states far away from Colorado. We went shopping for clothes that fit properly and made me feel confident rather than self-conscious. Most importantly, she never made me feel like a burden or a complication in her carefully organized life. I should have known it was too good to last. On Friday of my second week at Rebecca's, I woke up to find her sitting at the kitchen counter with a serious expression and a piece of paper in her hands. "Madison, I've been thinking about your situation," she began, and something in her tone made my stomach clench with dread. "You can't hide from reality forever. You need to start taking responsibility for your future." She slid the paper across the counter to me. It was a job application for a local senior care facility called Sunset Manor. "I appreciate everything you've done for me," I said carefully, "but I'm already taking a full course load and I have college applications to finish. I don't think I have time for a job right now." Rebecca's smile faltered slightly. "Madison, sweetie, you can't expect to live here indefinitely without contributing. I've been thinking about this a lot, and I believe some work experience would be good for you. It'll teach you valuable life skills." I felt a familiar chill run down my spine, the same sensation I'd learned to associate with danger at home, but I simply nodded and said, "Let me think about it over the weekend." That weekend, everything changed. Rebecca's warmth evaporated like morning dew. She stopped asking about my day or my feelings. She canceled our planned trip to Boulder to tour the University of Colorado campus. When I tried to bring up college applications, she became dismissive and distracted. On Monday morning, she cornered me before I could grab breakfast. "I've been getting calls from your parents," she said, her voice artificially sweet. "They're worried sick about you, Madison. They miss you terribly and want you to come home." My mouth went completely dry. "What did you tell them?" "I told them you're safe, of course, but I also mentioned some of the things you've shared with me about Marcus." Her eyes glittered with something that looked almost like malice. "I'm sure you wouldn't want those conversations to become public knowledge, would you?" I can only imagine how devastating it would be for your mother's catering business if rumors started spreading about her husband's inappropriate interest in her daughter. The threat was delivered so casually that it took a moment for the full horror to sink in. Rebecca was going to use my trauma as blackmail. "Your reputation at school would be ruined too," she continued. "People would always wonder if you were telling the truth or just causing drama for attention. And poor Marcus. Imagine how accusations like that would affect his construction business, all those clients who trust him to work in their homes with their own children around." I felt tears building, but I refused to let them fall. Rebecca reached across the counter and picked up the job application again. "Fortunately, I have a solution that benefits everyone. You take this job, you contribute to your own support while you're staying here, and we keep our private family conversations exactly where they belong, in the family." I stared at her for a long moment, seeing clearly for the first time. Rebecca hadn't rescued me from an abusive situation. She'd simply transferred me from one type of exploitation to another. The only difference was that she was smart enough to manipulate me psychologically rather than physically. "How much of my paycheck would you expect me to contribute?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. 70% seems fair," Rebecca said, as if she'd already calculated this down to the penny. "Room and board aren't free after all. Plus, you'll need to help with household maintenance. It's important for young people to learn responsibility." I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab the job application and tear it into tiny pieces. I wanted to call her every name I could think of and storm out of her house. Instead, I smiled. "Of course, Aunt Rebecca. That sounds very reasonable." If there was one valuable lesson I'd learned from living with Marcus, it was how to hide my true feelings behind a mask of compliance. People underestimate you when they think they've broken your spirit. They get careless. They make mistakes. And I was going to be ready when Rebecca made hers. "I'm so glad you understand, sweetheart." Rebecca beamed, completely missing the calculation behind my agreement. "I know this seems difficult now, but someday you'll thank me for teaching you these important life lessons." I nodded enthusiastically while my mind was already racing ahead, planning and strategizing. Rebecca thought she was so clever, but she'd just made a critical error. She'd revealed exactly how ruthless and manipulative she could be, which meant I no longer had to feel guilty about what I was going to do to her. The job at Sunset Manor turned out to be exactly as exploitative as I'd expected. I was hired as a care assistant, which meant I did all the physical labor that the actual nurses and medical staff didn't want to handle. I changed adult diapers, cleaned up vomit and other bodily fluids, fed residents who couldn't manage their own meals, and dealt with the most difficult behavioral cases. For this privilege, I earned $12.50 per hour. After taxes, my weekly paycheck was about $380. Rebecca immediately demanded her 70% cut, leaving me with roughly $114 per week for all my personal expenses: clothes, school supplies, gas money, food when I was at school, and the few small luxuries that made life bearable. But the money wasn't the worst part. The worst part was how Rebecca treated me once she had me trapped. Every weekend, she presented me with a detailed cleaning schedule for the entire house. I was expected to vacuum all the carpets, mop all the hardwood floors, clean both bathrooms from top to bottom, dust every surface, and organize her various collections of decorative items. If I missed anything or didn't meet her standards, she'd guilt me with subtle comments about how disappointed she was in my lack of attention to detail. She also began monitoring every aspect of my life with the obsessive control of a helicopter parent. She wanted to know exactly where I was going when I left the house, who I was spending time with, and what we were doing. She checked my phone regularly to make sure I was making good choices, and questioned me extensively about my interactions with coworkers and classmates. The psychological manipulation was constant and exhausting. Rebecca had a talent for delivering criticism in the form of concerned advice, making it difficult to argue with her without seeming ungrateful or irrational. "I noticed you seem tired lately, Madison. Are you sure you're getting enough sleep? You know, when I was your age, I found that cutting back on social media really helped me focus on what was important. You seem to be struggling with that algebra homework. Maybe if you spent less time texting Tyler and more time studying, your grades would improve. I'm worried about your attitude lately, sweetheart. You seem angry about something. I hope you're not letting negative influences at work or school affect your perspective on everything I've done for you." Every comment was designed to make me question my own perceptions and feel guilty for any resentment I harbored. Rebecca was a master manipulator, and I was forced to admire her technique even as I hated her for using it against me. But Rebecca had made one crucial mistake. She assumed that because I was young and financially dependent, I was also stupid and powerless. She was wrong. 3 weeks into my new life as Rebecca's indentured servant, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of fighting her overtly or trying to run away, I was going to study her. I was going to learn everything about manipulation, psychology, and strategic planning. I was going to become better at the game than she was. My first teacher was surprisingly helpful, Marcus himself. During our mandatory weekly phone calls with Mom and Marcus, I started paying attention to his techniques with fresh eyes. I watched how he used guilt, fear, and false concern to control conversations. I noticed how he planted seeds of doubt and insecurity, then positioned himself as the solution to the problems he'd created. "Madison, your mom and I are worried about you," Marcus would say during these calls, his voice perfectly calibrated to sound caring and paternal. "Rebecca mentioned you seem overwhelmed with work and school. Maybe you're taking on too much too soon. If you want to come home, we can work something out." The subtext was clear. He wanted me back under his direct control, and he was using my difficult situation at Rebecca's as leverage. But instead of feeling trapped, I began to appreciate the sophisticated psychology behind his approach. He never directly threatened or demanded. He simply created conditions where his preferred outcome seemed like the most logical choice. I started taking notes. My second education came from observing my coworkers at Sunset Manor. The senior care industry, I quickly learned, attracted two types of people: genuinely compassionate individuals who cared about helping elderly residents, and opportunistic predators who saw vulnerable seniors as easy targets for exploitation. I watched certified nursing assistants like Jennifer, a single mother in her 30s, who regularly pocketed small items from residents' rooms and skimmed cash from their personal allowances. I observed how she identified which residents were too confused or isolated to report theft, and how she rotated her targets to avoid detection. I also studied Sharon, a day shift supervisor who had perfected the art of emotional manipulation. She would single out the most anxious or lonely residents and gradually convince them that their families didn't really care about them. Once she'd established herself as their primary emotional support, she'd start requesting small favors, usually money for emergencies that never seemed to get repaid. Most disturbing of all was Raymond, a night shift security guard who had identified exactly which residents had dementia, severe enough to make their testimonies unreliable. I reported my suspicions about Raymond to the head nurse, who dismissed my concerns with the kind of professional indifference that made it clear this wasn't the first time she'd heard these allegations. All of these observations went into my secret notebook, hidden inside a hollowed-out copy of Pride and Prejudice that I kept in my school locker. I was building a comprehensive education in the psychology of exploitation, and my teachers had no idea they were being studied. At school, I began cultivating relationships with students who had skills I needed. Jake Williams was a quiet senior in my AP Computer Science class who knew everything about digital privacy and security. I mentioned my situation casually, framing it as academic curiosity about cybersecurity. Hypothetically, I said during one of our study sessions, if someone wanted to document evidence of financial exploitation, what would be the best way to do it without getting caught? Jake's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of a true tech geek getting to demonstrate his expertise. He taught me about encrypted cloud storage, VPN services, hidden camera apps, and digital forensics. Within a week, I had a sophisticated surveillance setup that would have impressed any private investigator. My third teacher was Rebecca herself. The more time I spent observing her, the more I recognized the calculated precision behind every interaction. Rebecca wasn't just a selfish opportunist, she was a skilled psychological predator who had turned exploitation into an art form. She had a particular talent for making her victims grateful for their own abuse. During conversations with her friends, she would describe me as a troubled teenager who was lucky to have somewhere stable to land after my difficult family situation. The implication was always that she was performing an act of charity by allowing me to work for her benefit. Rebecca also cultivated an image of herself as a successful, independent woman who mentored young people. She volunteered for career development programs at local high schools and frequently posted inspirational quotes about empowering the next generation on her social media accounts. The cognitive dissonance was staggering, but it was also illuminating. Rebecca genuinely believed that she was providing me with valuable life lessons. In her mind, teaching me to accept exploitation was preparing me for success in the adult world. I began to understand that people like Rebecca and Marcus weren't necessarily conscious of their own cruelty. They'd developed sophisticated justification systems that allowed them to see their abuse as education, their exploitation as opportunity, their control as protection. This insight became the foundation of my strategy. After 6 weeks of intensive study, I felt ready to begin phase 2 of my education, practical application. My first experiment in applied manipulation began with an elderly resident at Sunset Manor named Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell. Eleanor was 83, sharp as a tack mentally, and wealthy enough to afford the premium care package that included a private room and specialized services. She was also desperately lonely. Eleanor's son lived in California and visited maybe twice a year. Her daughter had died in a car accident 5 years earlier, and most of her friends were either dead or in similar care facilities. She spent most of her days sitting by her window, reading romance novels and watching the same cooking shows on repeat. I started spending my breaks in Eleanor's room, initially just making casual conversation while I folded her laundry or tidied her personal items. She was hungry for genuine human interaction, and I discovered that she had fascinating stories about her younger years as a secretary for a prominent Denver law firm in the 1960s and 70s. Within 2 weeks, I'd become Eleanor's favorite staff member. She always requested me specifically for assistance with personal care, and she began saving special snacks and magazines for my visits. More importantly, she began confiding in me about her fears and frustrations with other staff members. "That Jennifer girl has been in my room again," Eleanor whispered to me one afternoon. "I can't prove it, but I'm certain she took my silver hair comb, the one with the blue stones that belonged to my mother." I expressed appropriate sympathy and outrage, but I didn't immediately offer to investigate. Instead, I spent the next week building Eleanor's trust by solving smaller problems for her. When she mentioned that her television remote wasn't working properly, I fixed it. When she complained that her nighttime medications made her feel dizzy, I researched the interactions and helped her prepare questions for her doctor. By the end of that month, Eleanor saw me as not just a helpful aide, but as a trusted advocate who actually cared about her well-being. That's when I introduced the idea of surveillance. Mrs. Hartwell, I said carefully during one of our afternoon chats, what if we could catch whoever's been taking your things? I have a friend who's really good with technology, and he says there are tiny cameras now that are almost impossible to detect. Eleanor's eyes sparkled with the excitement of someone who'd been powerless for too long, finally being offered a chance to fight back. Within a week, Jake had provided me with 3 small wireless cameras disguised as common household items. I installed one in Eleanor's jewelry box, one on her bookshelf, and one near her private bathroom where staff members often went through her personal items unsupervised. The results were even better than I'd hoped. In just 2 weeks, we captured video evidence of Jennifer stealing not just from Eleanor, but from 4 other residents. Sharon was recorded going through Eleanor's personal papers and photographing financial documents. Most damning of all, we caught Raymond entering Eleanor's room during his night shift and standing over her bed while she slept, obviously planning something before losing his nerve. But I didn't turn the evidence over to management immediately. Instead, I showed it to Eleanor first. This is exactly what we need to protect you and the other residents, I told her, carefully monitoring her emotional response. But I'm worried about what might happen to me if management finds out I was recording without permission. Do you think we should find another way to handle this? Eleanor was outraged by what she'd seen, but she was also protective of me. What if I told them I installed the cameras myself? She suggested. I'm sure I could convince them that I felt unsafe and wanted to document what was happening. I pretended to consider this idea reluctantly, then agreed it might work. The next week, Eleanor presented the evidence to the head nurse as her own initiative. She explained that she'd felt unsafe and had used her own resources to install security cameras in her room. The video evidence was so damning that Jennifer was fired immediately, Sharon was suspended pending investigation, and Raymond was arrested on suspicion of elder abuse. More importantly, for my purposes, Eleanor became known throughout the facility as the resident who'd exposed a major theft and abuse ring. Her reputation transformed from lonely old lady to sharp-eyed advocate for resident safety, and everyone attributed her success to her own intelligence and initiative. Meanwhile, I remained completely invisible in the background, seen by management as just the helpful young aide who'd supported Mrs. Hartwell through her difficult experience. The experiment had been a perfect success. I'd demonstrated that I could identify targets, build trust, gather intelligence, and achieve significant results while maintaining complete deniability. I'd also learned that people were much more willing to accept dramatic claims when I game and the difference when I in a and under then I a deny they dermarces who seemed to have no personal agenda. Most importantly, I'd discovered that helping genuine victims could coexist with pursuing my own strategic goals. Eleanor truly was being exploited, and she genuinely deserved justice. The fact that her situation also provided me with an excellent learning opportunity didn't diminish the value of helping her. This realization became the cornerstone of my developing philosophy. The most effective revenge operates by exposing actual wrongdoing and helping real victims. When your targets are genuinely guilty, you don't need to manufacture evidence or create false narratives. You just need to ensure that their existing misconduct comes to light under the right circumstances. By the end of my 3rd month at Sunset Manor, I'd established myself as the most reliable and trustworthy aide on staff. Residents specifically requested me, families complimented my care during their visits, and management began suggesting that I consider pursuing a nursing degree after graduation. More importantly, I'd built a comprehensive intelligence network. I knew which staff members had substance abuse problems, which ones were stealing, which ones were romantically involved despite company policy, and which ones had been covering up medication errors and safety violations. I also had detailed financial records showing exactly how much money Rebecca was extorting from my paychecks, complete with her own handwritten receipts that clearly showed she was aware that what she was doing was ethically questionable. By December, 6 months after arriving at Rebecca's house, I was ready to begin the real work. The key to effective revenge, I'd learned, was patience and precision. Rather than striking back emotionally when I was angry or hurt, I needed to wait for the perfect moment when my targets were most vulnerable and least prepared to defend themselves. I also needed to ensure that when I did act, the consequences would be proportional, permanent, and impossible to trace back to me. This required 3 essential components: comprehensive intelligence, multiple attack vectors, and perfect timing. For intelligence, I'd spent months documenting every aspect of my family members' lives. I knew Mom's catering business was struggling financially because she'd taken out a high-interest loan to buy new equipment and was having trouble attracting enough clients to make the monthly payments. I knew Marcus's construction company was being investigated by the State Labor Board after a former employee filed a complaint about unsafe working conditions and unpaid overtime. I knew Rebecca was having trouble at her marketing job because her recent campaigns had failed to generate expected results, and her boss was questioning whether she understood their target demographic well enough to design effective strategies. Most importantly, I knew that all 3 of them were keeping significant secrets from each other. Mom didn't know about Marcus's gambling problem or the money he'd been hiding from their joint bank account to cover his losses. Marcus didn't know that Mom had borrowed money from her business account to pay for personal expenses, which could be considered embezzlement depending on how the business was legally structured. Rebecca didn't know that both Mom and Marcus were facing serious financial problems, and Mom and Marcus didn't know that Rebecca was using my situation to extort money from a teenager. Each of them was vulnerable, but they were most vulnerable when isolated from potential support systems. For attack vectors, I'd identified multiple ways to expose their misconduct simultaneously: social media, professional networks, family connections, and local community organizations all provided different avenues for spreading carefully crafted information. For timing, I was waiting for the perfect storm of circumstances that would maximize damage while minimizing my own exposure. That opportunity came in late January when Rebecca announced that she was hosting a family dinner party to celebrate my 18th birthday. "I think it's important for families to stay connected," she said, smiling with the kind of false warmth that I'd learned to recognize as particularly dangerous. "Besides, your parents have been so grateful for everything I've done for you. I'm sure they'd love to show their appreciation in some tangible way." The subtext was unmistakable. Rebecca was planning to use the dinner party to extract some kind of payment or commitment from Mom and Marcus. She probably figured that having me there as evidence of her generosity would make it difficult for them to refuse whatever she was planning to request. She had no idea that she was about to walk into a trap. The weeks leading up to the dinner party were a masterclass in psychological manipulation and strategic planning. I began planting seeds of doubt and suspicion among all the participants, using carefully crafted communications that seemed innocent individually, but would create maximum chaos when combined. For Mom, I sent a series of concerned text messages about Rebecca's behavior. "I'm worried about Aunt Rebecca. She seems really stressed about money lately, and she's been asking a lot of questions about your catering business. I hope she's not planning to ask you for a loan or anything." Rebecca mentioned that she knows Marcus has been having some problems at work. I didn't know what to say because I didn't realize she knew about the labor board investigation. "Did you tell her about that?" "I probably shouldn't mention this, but Rebecca has been making some strange comments about your marriage. She seems to think that you and Marcus are having problems. I told her everything was fine, but she seemed really interested in whether you guys were considering separation." For Marcus, I crafted messages that played on his paranoia and protective instincts. "I'm concerned about some things Aunt Rebecca has been saying about you. She seems to think there are problems with your business that Mom doesn't know about. I defended you, but she acted like she had inside information or something. Rebecca keeps asking me questions about your relationship with Mom. She wants to know if you guys argue about money and whether I think your marriage is stable. It's making me really uncomfortable. I think Rebecca might be planning to cause problems at the birthday dinner. She's been making comments about how families need to support each other financially and how successful relatives should help out when others are struggling. I'm worried she's going to put you and Mom on the spot about something. For Rebecca, I played up the concerned teenager angle. I'm worried about Mom and Marcus. They've been fighting a lot lately about money, and I think Marcus might be gambling again. I hope they're not planning to ask you for help, because I know how hard you work for your money. Marcus said some weird things about you last time we talked. He seemed to think you were judging him and Mom for their financial situation. I told him that wasn't true, but he seemed really angry about something. I'm nervous about the dinner party because Mom and Marcus have been acting strange lately. Mom keeps asking questions about how much money I make and whether you've been helping me save anything. I think they might be planning to ask if I can contribute to household expenses or something. By the time the dinner party arrived, all three of them were primed for conflict. Each person came armed with suspicions about the other two, and each believed that I was an innocent victim caught in the middle of adult drama. They had no idea that I was the architect of their mutual distrust. The birthday dinner party was scheduled for Sunday evening, February 14th, Valentine's Day, which added an extra layer of symbolic significance that I appreciated. Rebecca had spent weeks planning the menu and decorating her townhome, obviously intending to create an atmosphere of family unity and celebration. She'd even bought an expensive bottle of champagne to mark my transition into legal adulthood. I arrived early to help with preparations, playing the role of the grateful niece who wanted everything to be perfect. Rebecca was in an excellent mood, chattering about her plans for the evening and her excitement about bringing the family back together. "I've been thinking a lot about family lately," she said while arranging flowers on the dining table, "about how important it is for people to support each other through difficult times. You're so lucky to have parents who care enough to make sure you're in a stable environment while you figure out your future." I nodded enthusiastically while mentally reviewing the timeline I'd planned for the evening. "I'm really grateful for everything you've done for me, Aunt Rebecca. I hope Mom and Marcus understand how much you've sacrificed." "Oh, I'm sure they do," Rebecca said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "In fact, I'm hoping we can talk tonight about how they might start contributing more substantially to your support. You're 18 now, which means you're legally an adult, but that doesn't mean you're ready to be completely independent." There it was, the opening move I'd been expecting. Rebecca was planning to use my birthday celebration as leverage to extract money from my parents, while positioning herself as the responsible adult who was protecting my interests. Mom and Marcus arrived exactly on time, bearing gifts and wearing the kind of forced smiles that indicated they were both prepared for conflict. I greeted them with genuine enthusiasm, playing the role of the daughter who'd missed her family and was excited about this reunion. Madison, you look wonderful," Mom said, holding me at arm's length to study my appearance. "Rebecca's been taking excellent care of you." "Marcus has been working so hard lately," I told Rebecca while giving my stepfather a hug that I hoped seemed natural rather than strategic. "His business is doing really well, but the stress has been wearing on him." I watched Marcus's eyes narrow slightly as he processed this comment. He was already suspicious about what Rebecca might know about his professional problems, and my innocent observation reinforced his paranoia. The first hour passed pleasantly enough. We exchanged small talk about my school performance, college applications, and work experience at Sunset Manor. Rebecca played the perfect hostess, ensuring everyone's wine glass stayed full while steering conversation toward topics that highlighted her role as my mentor and protector. I watched all three of them carefully, noting the subtle signs of tension that were building beneath the surface civility. Mom kept glancing at Marcus whenever Rebecca mentioned money or financial responsibility. Marcus was drinking faster than usual and occasionally checking his phone, probably monitoring messages from creditors or business associates. Rebecca was performing her charming hostess routine a little too intensely, which suggested she was nervous about the pitch she was planning to make. After dinner, as we moved to the living room for dessert and gift opening, Rebecca poured the champagne and made a toast to family, responsibility, and Madison's bright future. That's when she launched into the speech I'd been anticipating. I've been honored to provide Madison with a stable home environment during what I know has been a challenging time for all of you, Rebecca began, her tone perfectly calibrated between gracious and pointed. But as she transitions into adulthood, I think it's important for us to discuss how her support system should evolve. Mom and Marcus exchanged a quick glance that confirmed they'd been expecting something like this. Madison is such a bright, capable young woman, Rebecca continued, but she's not ready for complete independence yet. She's been learning valuable life skills through her work experience, but she's also been contributing significantly to her own support. I've been covering the majority of her living expenses, of course, but I think as her parents, you should consider how you might start sharing more of that financial responsibility. The silence that followed was electric with tension. What kind of contribution are you thinking about? Mom asked carefully. Well, Rebecca said, settling back into her chair with the confidence of someone who thought she held all the cards. Madison's been earning about $380 per week at her job. After covering her basic living expenses, I've been able to help her save about $114 per week toward her college fund. I was thinking that if you could match that amount, we could really start building a substantial nest egg for her education. I watched Mom's face carefully as she processed this information. I could see the exact moment when she realized the math didn't add up. Wait, Mom said slowly. If Madison's earning $380 per week and you're only saving $114 of that, where's the other $260 going? Rebecca's confident smile faltered slightly. Room and board aren't free, Janet. Madison's been contributing to household expenses, which I think is appropriate for a young adult. Contributing $260 out of $380? Marcus interjected, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. That's 70% of her income, Rebecca. That's not teaching responsibility, that's exploitation. I resent that accusation, Rebecca snapped, her composure beginning to crack. I've provided Madison with a safe environment when you obviously couldn't. If you're upset about the financial arrangements, maybe you should have been better parents in the first place. The room exploded into chaos. Better parents? Mom stood up abruptly, knocking over her champagne glass. Are you seriously lecturing us about parenting while you're extorting money from our daughter? Extorting? Rebecca's voice rose to match Mom's volume. I've been providing her with room and board while she learns life skills, something she obviously wasn't getting at home, based on what she's told me about Marcus. Marcus went very still, which I recognized as his most dangerous state. What exactly has Madison told you about me, Rebecca? I could see Rebecca realizing that she'd overplayed her hand, but she was too angry to back down gracefully. She's told me enough, Rebecca said coldly, about your inappropriate behavior, your boundary issues, your obsession with controlling her social life. Did you really think that forcing yourself into a parental role with a teenage girl wouldn't eventually backfire? That's it, Marcus said, standing up with the kind of controlled fury that I remembered from my worst childhood moments. We're leaving, and Madison's coming with us. Actually, I said quietly, speaking for the first time since the arguing had begun, I think there are some things all of you should know before anyone makes decisions about my future. All three of them turned to look at me with expressions ranging from surprise to alarm. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, along with a small digital recorder that I'd been running throughout dinner. I've been documenting everything, I said calmly, for months now, and I think it's time for some honest conversations about what's been happening in this family. The silence was absolute. Rebecca, I began, looking directly at my aunt, you've been financially exploiting me while telling people that you're providing charity to a troubled teenager. You've taken over $4,000 from my paychecks while making me work as your unpaid housekeeper and emotional support system. That's not mentoring, that's trafficking. Rebecca's face went white. Madison, you don't understand. I understand perfectly, I interrupted, and I have detailed financial records, photographs of your handwritten receipts, and recorded conversations where you explicitly acknowledge that what you're doing is questionable. I also have evidence of the blackmail you used to keep me from reporting your exploitation. I turned to Marcus next. And you've been sexually harassing and grooming me since I was 8 years old. I have a journal documenting specific incidents, times, and dates going back almost 10 years. I also have recordings of some of your more explicitly inappropriate comments. Shashan maar, so abonnats. Marcus looked like he was going to be sick. Madison, that's not. Deraser shinern anahat down salkens. So, it absolutely is, I said firmly. And Mom, you've known something was wrong for years, but you chose to ignore it because acknowledging the truth would have complicated your financial security and social status. Mom started crying, but I wasn't finished. Here's what's going to happen, I continued, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. I'm moving out of Rebecca's house tonight. I've already secured different housing arrangements through a program for exploited teenagers that Mrs. Hartwell at my job helped me find. I'm also going to finish my senior year while working toward legal emancipation. I looked at each of them in turn. Rebecca, you're going to repay every penny you've taken from my paychecks, plus interest. If you don't, I'll be filing reports with the Department of Labor, the IRS, and the local news stations that would love to do an investigative piece about successful professional women who exploit vulnerable teenagers. Marcus, you're going to stay away from me completely. If you contact me directly or try to interfere with my independence, I'll be filing police reports and restraining orders. I also have copies of my documentation stored with multiple trusted adults who have instructions to take action if anything happens to me. And Mom, you're going to need to decide whether you want a relationship with your daughter or with your husband, because you can't have both. I won't be in the same room with him ever again, and I won't pretend that this family can function normally around his behavior. I stood up and gathered my things while they sat in stunned silence. I'll be back next week to collect my belongings, I said. Rebecca, I'll expect the first payment from you by Friday. Mom, you can call me when you've made your decision about your priorities. I paused at the front door and looked back at the three of them sitting around Rebecca's destroyed dinner party. Oh, and happy birthday to me, I added. I think 18 is going to be an excellent year. Walking out of Rebecca's house that night felt like stepping out of a burning building, simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. I had nowhere to go in the immediate sense, but I'd planned for this contingency. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell had connected me with a social worker named Catherine Rodriguez, who specialized in cases involving teenage exploitation and family dysfunction. Catherine had helped me research options for immediate housing and legal emancipation, and she'd been on standby for weeks waiting for my call. Madison? Catherine's voice was warm and professional when I called from the bus station downtown. Are you ready to make the move we discussed? I am, I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. Everything went exactly as we planned. The emergency youth shelter that Catherine had arranged was clean, safe, and populated mostly by teenagers who'd fled similar family situations. My roommate was a 17-year-old named Ashley, who'd been living independently for 6 months after aging out of the foster care system. So, the first week is always the hardest. Ashley told me that first night as we lay in our narrow beds discussing our respective situations. You keep expecting someone to show up and drag you back to whatever you were running from, but after a while you realize that you're actually free. She was right. For the first few days, I jumped every time my phone rang, expecting Rebecca or Mom or Marcus to have found some new way to manipulate me back into compliance. But as the week progressed, I began to appreciate the profound difference between authentic independence and the illusion of safety I'd been chasing for months. Nobody at the shelter expected me to be grateful for basic human decency. Nobody demanded payment for respecting my boundaries or treating me with dignity. Nobody monitored my conversations or questioned my right to privacy and personal autonomy. It was the first time in my life that I'd experienced unconditional safety. The practical challenges were significant but manageable. Catherine helped me apply for emergency financial assistance and navigate the legal emancipation process. I was able to continue working at Sunset Manor while attending my final semester of high school, and my supervisor was supportive when I explained my housing situation in general terms. Most importantly, I began the process of building genuine relationships with people who valued me as a person rather than seeing me as a resource to be exploited. Mrs. Hartwell became an unofficial grandmother figure, checking on me regularly and providing guidance about financial planning and college preparation. Jake from my computer science class turned out to be not just technically skilled, but also incredibly loyal and trustworthy. He helped me maintain digital security while I transitioned to independence. Catherine introduced me to other teenagers who'd successfully navigated similar family crises, and I began to understand that my experiences weren't unique or shameful. They were part of a larger pattern of exploitation that affected thousands of young people across the country. This perspective shift was crucial for my emotional recovery. For years, I'd blamed myself for my family's dysfunction, assuming that I must have done something to provoke their inappropriate behavior. Learning that exploitation follows predictable patterns helped me understand that their choices reflected their own psychological problems rather than any deficiency on my part. 6 weeks after the confrontation dinner, Rebecca made her first payment, $1,000 toward the money she'd taken from my paychecks. She included a note that said, "I hope you understand that I was trying to teach you responsibility, but I see now that my methods were misguided. I wish you well." I deposited the check without responding to her note. There was nothing to discuss. Marcus attempted to contact me multiple times through various channels: text messages, phone calls, emails, and even letters delivered to the shelter. I forwarded everything to Catherine, who documented the harassment and helped me file for a restraining order. The court hearing for the restraining order was the first time I'd seen Marcus since the dinner party. He looked haggard and defeated, sitting beside a court-appointed lawyer who'd obviously explained that his client was facing serious potential consequences. When the judge asked if I wanted to make a statement, I stood up and spoke clearly and confidently about the years of inappropriate behavior and the recent harassment. I didn't dramatize or exaggerate. I simply stated facts and dates and described the impact his actions had had on my sense of safety. The judge granted a 5-year restraining order without hesitation. Mom was the most complicated relationship to navigate. She called me almost every day for the first month, alternating between apologies, guilt trips, and desperate attempts to negotiate some kind of reconciliation that would allow her to maintain her marriage while repairing our relationship. "Madison, please come home," she begged during one particularly difficult conversation. "Marcus is getting counseling. He's really committed to changing. We can make this work if we all just try harder." "Mom," I said gently but firmly, "he's been getting counseling for years. The problem isn't that he doesn't understand his behavior is wrong. The problem is that he doesn't care. And your willingness to prioritize his comfort over my safety tells me everything I need to know about your priorities." That's not fair," Mom protested. "I'm trying to hold our family together." "There is no family to hold together," I said. "Marcus destroyed that when he decided to treat me like his personal property. You destroyed it when you chose to look the other way. I'm not responsible for fixing what both of you broke." These conversations were emotionally exhausting, but they were also necessary for establishing boundaries and helping Mom understand that reconciliation would require genuine accountability rather than superficial apologies. By graduation day in May, I'd achieved legal emancipation, secured a scholarship to attend Colorado State University in the fall, and saved enough money to cover my first year's living expenses. I'd also completed a volunteer training program to become a peer counselor for other teenagers dealing with family exploitation. Most importantly, I'd learned to distinguish between justice and revenge. Justice meant protecting myself and other vulnerable people from further harm. It meant creating accountability for harmful behavior and working towards systemic changes that would prevent other young people from experiencing similar exploitation. Revenge would have meant trying to destroy my family members' lives purely for the satisfaction of watching them suffer. I chose justice. The first year of college was transformative in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not just academically, though studying psychology and social work provided fascinating insights into the dynamics I'd experienced, but personally. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who'd chosen to know me, rather than people who saw me as an obligation or an opportunity. My roommate, Stephanie, was a sociology major from Alaska who'd grown up in a genuinely healthy family and couldn't quite comprehend the level of dysfunction I'd escaped. Her stories about family dinners where people actually listened to each other and respected boundaries seemed like fairy tales to me initially. "Your parents call just to check how you're doing?" I asked after overhearing one of her conversations with her mother. "They don't want money or favors or information they can use against you later?" Stephanie looked at me with the kind of concerned confusion that made me realize how distorted my baseline expectations had become. "Madison, most parents actually care about their children's happiness and well-being," she said gently. "What you've described isn't normal family conflict, it's systematic abuse." Through Stephanie and her friends, I began to understand what healthy relationships looked like. People who cared about each other didn't keep score of favors and obligations. They didn't use emotional manipulation to control behavior. They respected each other's autonomy and celebrated each other's successes without feeling threatened. This education in normal human interaction was as valuable as anything I learned in my formal classes. During my sophomore year, I received an unexpected call from Mrs. Hartwell, who'd become a kind of surrogate grandmother over the previous 2 years. "Madison, dear, I have some news about your family that you might want to know about," she said carefully. "I ran into your mother at the grocery store last week, and she looked, well, not well." According to Mrs. Hartwell, Mom had lost significant weight and seemed anxious and distracted during their brief conversation. More significantly, she'd mentioned that Marcus was going through some legal difficulties and that their finances were very tight right now. I thanked Mrs. Hartwell for the information but didn't pursue any details. Whatever was happening with Marcus and Mom was the consequence of choices they'd made long before I left their house. My responsibility was to continue building my own life, not to monitor the destruction of theirs. But curiosity is a powerful force, and after several weeks of wondering, I decided to do some discreet research. Jake, now a computer science major at the University of Colorado, helped me gather publicly available information about my family's current situation. What we found was more dramatic than I'd expected. Marcus's construction business had been shut down by the state labor board after multiple violations were discovered during their investigation. He'd been fined heavily and was facing potential criminal charges for endangering workers and falsifying safety records. The combination of legal fees, fines, and lost income had apparently pushed him into bankruptcy. Mom's catering business had also failed, apparently due to a combination of financial mismanagement and reputation damage from being associated with Marcus's legal problems. She'd been forced to sell most of her equipment and was now working as a line cook at a chain restaurant. Rebecca had been fired from her marketing job after her boss discovered that she'd been inflating campaign metrics and misrepresenting client feedback. She'd moved back to Nebraska to live with her elderly parents while searching for new employment. All three of them were facing exactly the kind of financial and professional consequences that I might have orchestrated if I'd chosen the path of revenge rather than justice. But I hadn't needed to actively sabotage them. Their own dishonesty and exploitation had eventually caught up with them naturally. This realization was both satisfying and sobering. It confirmed that people who habitually harm others tend to create unsustainable situations that eventually collapse under their own weight. But it also reminded me that focusing on their destruction would have prevented me from building something positive in my own life. During my junior year, Mom reached out to me again after almost 2 years of silence. "Madison, I know I don't have the right to ask for anything," she said when I answered her call, "but I wanted you to know that I've left Marcus. The divorce will be final next month." I felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and caution. "What made you finally decide to leave?" The investigation into his business practices brought up some things about his personal behavior that I couldn't ignore anymore, Mom said quietly. "Things that made me realize you were trying to protect yourself from something I should have recognized years ago." We talked for almost an hour that night. Mom didn't ask for forgiveness or try to minimize her role in what had happened. She simply acknowledged that she'd failed me as a parent and expressed regret that it had taken legal consequences to force her to face the truth about Marcus. I understand if you never want to see me again," Mom said near the end of our conversation, "but I wanted you to know that you were right about everything, and I'm sorry I didn't listen when you tried to tell me." Over the following months, Mom and I began the slow, careful process of rebuilding a relationship. It started with weekly phone calls and gradually expanded to occasional coffee meetings when I was home on breaks. We established clear boundaries, no discussions of Marcus, no attempts to recreate our previous family dynamic, no expectations that forgiveness meant forgetting. It was a different kind of relationship than what we'd had before, but it was honest in a way that our previous connection had never been. Rebecca never attempted to contact me directly, but she did send a check for the remaining $2,400 she owed me, along with a brief note acknowledging that her behavior had been inappropriate and harmful. I deposited the check and donated half the money to a local organization that supported teenage victims of family exploitation. Marcus made several attempts to reach out through mutual acquaintances and social media, but I blocked all communication and maintained the restraining order. Some boundaries aren't meant to be flexible, and my safety required his complete absence from my life. By my senior year, I'd decided to pursue a master's degree in social work with a specialization in adolescent trauma and family systems. My own experiences had given me insights that could be valuable for helping other young people navigate similar situations, and I'd discovered that I had both the emotional resilience and the analytical skills necessary for that kind of work. More importantly, I'd learned that survival wasn't just about escaping harmful situations. It was about building the kind of life that made the escape worthwhile. 3 years later, I graduated with my MSW and accepted a position with the Colorado Department of Human Services, working specifically with teenagers in crisis situations. My caseload includes kids dealing with family exploitation, domestic violence, substance abuse, and various forms of neglect and abandonment. The work is challenging and sometimes heartbreaking, but it's also profoundly meaningful. Every teenager I help navigate towards safety and independence represents a small victory against the kinds of systems that nearly destroyed my own life. One of my current cases involves a 16-year-old girl named Sarah, whose stepfather has been exhibiting inappropriate behavior while her mother works evening shifts. Sarah's situation is heartbreakingly familiar. The subtle grooming, the boundary violations, the manipulation designed to make her question her own perceptions. But unlike my younger self, Sarah has access to resources and support systems that can protect her without requiring her to sacrifice years of her life to strategic planning and emotional warfare. "I feel like I'm going crazy," Sarah told me during our second session. "Sometimes I think I'm imagining things or being overdramatic. Maybe he really is just trying to be a good stepfather." "Trust your instincts," I told her firmly. "People who have good intentions don't make you feel unsafe or uncomfortable, and people who care about your well-being don't ask you to keep their behavior secret." Working with Sarah and teenagers like her has given me perspective on my own journey. I spent years learning to manipulate and strategize because I didn't have access to the kinds of institutional support and legal protections that exist today. I had to become calculating and ruthless because those were the only tools available to someone in my position. But the next generation doesn't have to fight those battles alone. Last month, I received an invitation to speak at a conference about adolescent trauma and recovery. The organizers wanted me to share my story as an example of someone who'd successfully transitioned from victim to advocate. "What would you tell teenagers who are currently trapped in exploitative family situations?" one audience member asked during the Q&A session. "I'd tell them that playing dumb isn't just about survival," I said. "Sometimes it's about gathering intelligence while you're building the strength and resources you need to escape. But I'd also tell them that they don't have to do it alone anymore. There are people and organizations specifically trained to help, and seeking that help isn't weakness, it's strategy." Another audience member asked whether I'd ever felt guilty about the consequences my family members had experienced. I thought carefully before answering. I felt guilty for a long time about wanting justice, I said. I'd been taught that good people forgive and forget, that holding people accountable for their behavior was somehow petty or vindictive, but I've learned that accountability isn't about punishment. It's about protection. When people face consequences for harmful behavior, they're less likely to harm others in the future. Did you ever consider trying to repair those relationships? Someone else asked. I did repair the one relationship that was worth repairing, I said. My mother and I have built something new based on honesty and accountability. But not all relationships can or should be repaired. Some people's behavior is so consistently harmful that the only safe response is permanent distance. After the conference, a young woman approached me with a familiar look of determination and barely suppressed anger. I'm 17, she said. My situation is similar to yours, and I've been planning something dramatic. But after hearing you speak, I'm wondering if there's a better way. We talked for almost an hour about her options, her support systems, and the resources available to help her transition to safety without sacrificing her own emotional health in the process. The goal isn't to destroy them, I told her as we exchanged contact information. The goal is to build something better for yourself. Everything else is just details. Driving home that night, I thought about the difference between the teenager I'd been and the woman I'd become. That desperate, calculating girl who'd spent months planning elaborate revenge schemes had been brilliant and resourceful, but she'd also been profoundly alone. The woman I am now has meaningful work, genuine relationships, and a sense of purpose that extends beyond my own survival. I've learned that the most complete victory isn't about watching your enemies fall. It's about building a life so fulfilling that their opinions and actions become irrelevant. Sometimes people ask if I ever think about what might have happened if I'd chosen forgiveness over justice, reconciliation over separation. The answer is that I chose the only path that led to genuine safety and authentic peace. I spent my adolescence learning that playing dumb could be a survival skill, but I spent my adulthood learning that playing smart, seeking help, building community, working toward justice is what actually leads to freedom. And freedom, I've discovered, is worth every strategic move it took to achieve it.